Welcome to St. James's Wednesday night fellowship and study. We are here gathered tonight to continue our series on uncovering our history, covering St. James's history, and tonight our history with St. Phillips Episcopal Church, covering the years 1830 to 1865. And we're delighted to have Ken Anderson here, who will be speaking, our primary speaker tonight. He's worked alongside and collaborated with our history team. What are our history team members? If you're here, do you mind giving a wave? We've got Alice Toussignan, who's headed up the project. Let's see, who else is here? Andy Bennett,
Jane.
Mary Lou Lee, Jane Dowrick. Thank you. Thanks for piping up because I can't see everybody. So we're delighted to be digging into this. This is part of what our presiding Bishop Michael Curry has called the Episcopal Church to becoming beloved community. The Episcopal Church started with General Convention about 50 or 60 years ago, saying we need to wrestle with our history, our theology. We need to talk about race relations in the Episcopal Church and reckon with and repent and move towards becoming beloved community together. Well, in 2015, they finally got money to actually take let this ministry hit the road, and along with the help of some amazing priests and lay people, developed Sacred Ground, for example, is one such program to come out of becoming beloved community. We know that other Episcopal churches have been digging into their history too across the country. You can Google that and come up with a number of newspaper articles, even just down around our area. So without further ado, I want to hand this over for a moment to Alice Toussignan to take it away.
Okay, I'm going to introduce Ken. So Ken Anderson is a native of the Philadelphia area who came to Richmond to go to the University of Richmond. He graduated with a BA in Leadership and American Studies in 2017, and then came back to the University of Richmond School of Law, and he graduated last year. Ken has family roots in Richmond and at St. Phillips, dating back to 1896, and has attended the parish since his sophomore year of college, where he serves. I guess you serve on the vestry now, Ken.
Correct.
He has been published in the RTD and the University of Richmond School of Law Public Interest Law Review, and enjoys researching topics surrounding local history and American racial history. And I also might add that he is researching the history of St. Phillips that started in 1861, and hopefully we'll be revealing some of that at some kind of celebration of their 160th birthday celebration, which is this year. So without any further ado, let me introduce Ken Anderson, who we have collaborated on this.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Alice. It has been great to work with you so far. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ken Anderson, as Alice just said. Thank you so much for having me. If you hear any background noise, I explained to everybody in the social part that I'm in New York City, actually. So if you hear taxis and honking and things, that's all it is. So I'm going to share my screen quickly so that we can get started on the presentation. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So today we'll be talking about the relationship between St. Philip's Church and St. James's Church in Richmond. If you did not know, St. James was one of the primary parishes that actually helped found St. Philip's in 1861. Whoops. So this slide does not necessarily have to do with the relationship between our two parishes, but it is near and dear to my heart. The larger picture is actually the funeral of my great-great-grandfather in 1947 in front of St. Philip's at its St. James and Lee location You can see there's some family members there. Father Aston Hamilton is walking out of the doors, and he's Congressman McEachin's grandfather. And Robert Scott, who is the man standing at the base of the steps, he started one of the first Black funeral homes in Richmond. So that's just near and dear to my heart. But my two great-great-grandparents who joined St. Phillips in 1919 are pictured there, George W. Scott and Lucy Braxton Scott. Both were lifelong Episcopalians. So really my interest in St. Philip's history and church history started in my sophomore year at the University of Richmond. And also it's great to see you, Dr. Crutcher, president of the greatest school on earth. It started where I actually was able to do some research on my family history in Richmond beginning before the Civil War. So my grandmother's side of the family actually has free people of color on both sides. So it was very easy, or it was easier to find the roots. And of course, they are very tied to the Episcopal Church. So since then, I've just been all things St. Phillips. I asked Reverend Marlene earlier this year, right before the pandemic began, if we could celebrate our 160th anniversary with an actual church history. So currently working on a project that hopefully will be a book by the end of it. There are about 125 pages written, but working on a campaign right now, so have not written too much recently. But the goal is to have a full volume of our history, and the hope is that it tells the story of Black
I believe we may have lost Ken. Everybody else is still here. Let's see if we can get him back online. Let's see. Looks as though he's logged off, so hopefully he's trying to get back in. We'll just wait a few moments.
He said he's coming back now, the Wi-Fi. Something with the Wi-Fi. He'll be right back.
Fabulous,
Welcome.
thank you. We were talking about some of the blessings of virtual formation earlier. And here we have a hiccup.
Here we have one of the curses.
Yes.
We call that not an exact science.
Here we go.
I'm very sorry, everybody. It never fails that when you're in the midst of a presentation that your Wi-Fi goes out. So I'm so sorry.
We'll have to edit that part out, Hillary, or we'll just edit it down so it seems like, you know, nothing happened.
So sorry about that.
No, no worries.
Is there any chance that I can share my screen again so I can give the
Yes.
start the PowerPoint?
I'll make you the co-host. Let's see.
I'll say this happened once before, right in the middle of the communion piece of our recorded service about 2 months ago. So I just have a great track record at this point. Let's see. All right. Is everybody able to see my screen?
Not just yet.
Not just yet. How about now?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay.
Not yet.
1 second. So sorry for the delay, everyone.
Please don't worry about it.
Mm-mm. We've all been there.
Kein Problem.
I have to say that these sorts
There
of
you go.
made
Perfect.
people really full of grace, I think.
That is for sure. And by the way, while we're speaking, what I'll do is I actually made a handout for this talk, so I will share that. And Lord willing, the Wi-Fi will not go out again. But I will put the handout in the chat just so that if you have some questions, I can show that to you. So 1 second. Okay, we'll get started, and then I'll throw that in the chat very shortly. So where I think I left off was I was telling about my family history at St. Phillips. But of course, this talk is about St. James and St. Philip's relationships. I just wanted to give a frame of reference of sort of what we're doing at St. Philip's to celebrate our 160th anniversary. So let's start at the very beginning. The year is 1859. And as you know, the Civil War has not begun yet. Slavery is still very much entrenched in Virginia and in the city of Richmond. And actually, starting in the 1840s, the man that is on the screen, the Right Reverend John Johns, he was the Assistant Bishop of Virginia at the time under Bishop William Meade. And he actually was one of the, he would be called, I guess, a liberal for his day. He was born in Delaware and then moved to Virginia and served the diocese for many years. But he had the idea actually to start a, to use his word, a colored congregation as early as 1849 in Richmond. So it was quite early that he was interested in saving the souls of Black folk in Virginia. So in 1859, he finally got his wish. He, along with some other liberal members within the diocese, namely from St. James, St. Paul's, and Monumental Church, actually called for the creation for the, quote, instruction of the servants of Richmond and vicinity. So I put servants in italics for two reasons. So it is not completely inaccurate in that Richmond is one of the few cities in the South that had a very unique situation when it came to slavery, where there was a large urban slave population. So actually many slaves did not have the traditional plantation lifestyle that is typically shown in movies. So actually slaves were working in factories, slaves were working as small artisans, and at the same time, still slaves, of course. And there was also a large community of free African Americans that lived in Richmond, some of them my own family. So in 1859, in the Diocesan Council reports from 1859 and 1860, there's a lot of discussion both about the brewing secession that would eventually occur in 1861 and the education of Negroes within the Episcopal Church. The diocese, it's a very interesting relationship that the diocese had with African Americans at the time that was covered mostly last week in the talk. But it was significant enough that members of St. James, St. Paul's, and Monumental donated $10,000 for the sustenance and construction of the church building. So St. Philip's first church building was on North 4th Street between Jackson and Lee. And now I'm sure that that block does not exist in the same way that it did in 1861. That northwestern corner of the city at the time, which is now well within Jackson Ward, was actually the edge of the city and one of the centers for where free Blacks and urban slaves lived in the city of Richmond. So immediately, St. James actually started our first Sunday school, which was done at actually the church at St. James, and then later brought to St. Philip's once St. Philip's got on its feet. So St. James really played a pivotal role in our first years as a parish by, again, establishing the first Sunday school and then supplying clerical personnel during, before, and immediately after the Civil War. What you do have to know is that St. Philip's came into the diocese not as an equal partner. So as many parishes are founded with a vestry already started and with money in the bank and maybe a church building built, St. Philip's was looked at as somewhat of a charity case for the diocese. And it was a status that really members worked really hard to erase for the next 100 years and really strove to gain that full independence and full self-sustaining parish status. So it was originally placed under the control of diocesan officials And I really encourage all of you to read some of the diocesan council reports from that era. All of them have some very interesting and somewhat disturbing quotes of how people saw Black people back then. So we're, the members of St. Phillips, though some of them were educated, though some of them were free, were spoken of as if they were children who did not understand anything other than, you'd hope that they would have understood the saving grace of Jesus, but other than that, there was very little credit given to them. Despite all of the racism, the first service at St. Phillips was celebrated on the first Sunday of November in 1861. And at St. Phillips today, we still have homecoming that time of the year as a result. So why was St. Phillips founded? And when, at the time that it was founded, it was 1861. As you know, the South was ready to secede from the Union over the question of slavery and the election of Lincoln. And before St. Phillips was founded and Black folks had their own congregation within Richmond, there were a few Black Episcopal churches in the North, but we are actually one of the oldest in the South. So before St. Phillips was founded, Black Episcopalians would worship with their slaveholders and were often relegated to stand or sit in a balcony, as was discussed last week. It's a really interesting dichotomy between the mission mindset of the church at that time, where they're really reaching out to make sure that Black souls are saved. And yet so many of the members of the congregation did not necessarily believe in Black humanity, or at least in Black equality on a biological standpoint. So that is just a really interesting paradox of the founding of the parish. So also, it was very interesting that the diocese, Bishop Meade, Bishop Whittle before him, and then Bishop Johns were all very concerned about the increase of Black membership in the Baptist and Methodist Church. So that was very interesting that the diocese from the very beginning definitely wanted a Black base of membership. So I pulled this quote just because I thought it was interesting. I did grow up Baptist too, so my family switched and then I came back to the Episcopal Church. But the grand, I'll quote Bishop Johns, he said, "The grand attraction of Blacks to the Methodist and Baptist denominations, quote, consisted in immersion, a mode of baptism, which we're all told has a peculiar fascination for colored people." So again, this shows the real disconnect between white folks understanding what Black folks were about in 1860, and really, again, questioning the intelligence of the race. But yet, nonetheless, of course, the church was founded for the worship, for Black people's worship. This is a picture of the original church that was on North 4th Street. And this image is actually from a woodcut from 1867 that was featured in Harper's Weekly magazine, one of a very popular magazine of the late 19th century. And though the image is a bit grainy, all of these folks in front are likely freedmen at that point. And this church building was a wood building, Gothic style. And there are no interior images that exist, but I would assume that it was likely a sparsely furnished church, and vestry records mirror that suggestion. So as we know, 1861, Fort Sumter is attacked, the nation goes to war, and it is divided. Richmond plays a very important role in the Confederacy and becomes its capital in May of 1861. And despite the war, both St. James and St. Phillips held services, and actually multiple services per week. So despite the fact that war was very, very, very close to home, there was still worship going on. The congregation, our congregation actually did hold services throughout the war and submitted reports to the Diocesan Council, which was the forerunner to the current Diocesan Convention. And actually, so St. Phillips would have afternoon services and St. James would have morning services. And that was because the diocese did not yet have any ordained Black ministers within the Commonwealth of Virginia. So actually, St. James's associate ministers or their supply priests would actually come to St. Phillips in the afternoon after having preached in the morning at St. James. In 1865, the state of Richmond was just a wreck. So much of the city had burned because upon the fall, people burned the tobacco warehouses. The section of the city where St. James and St. Phillips was located did not burn during the war. However, the congregation was in disarray as so many African Americans left the South and left for different places to try to figure out what to do now with their new freed status. So just everything is in a state of disarray, and that reflects. We actually did not even submit a diocesan report from 1865 to 1867. It was very interesting. In 1864, St. Phillips actually reported a sprawling congregation, while some of the larger white churches actually reported major deaths because of soldiers dying on the Confederate side. And then after the Civil War, unfortunately, many African Americans did associate the Episcopal Church with slavery. So they saw their masters in the sanctuary, and they decided that they were going to go for churches that had taken more of a definitive stand on slavery, like the Baptist Church, or churches that were very independent, like the Baptist Church, where they could sort of make their own congregations. So between the late 1860s was an era of struggle for St. Phillips. Despite the fact that so many African Americans left the church right after the Civil War, actually there was one population within the African American race that actually was very attracted to the Episcopal Church, and this is continued until today. So former slaves who were literate or former free blacks actually came to the Episcopal Church, as it was seen as a social status symbol to actually attend a liturgical service and to actually be able to read your prayers. So if you just take that step back and think about the fact that so many African Americans at the time were not actually literate, so they had a lot of difficulty actually participating in the service. There is one really, really great piece about this period where, though the church itself was actually struggling and there were only 30 and 40 members at one point, the Sunday school, again founded by some St. James members and then sustained by Black and white teachers as early as 1867, was just thriving. So by 1866, there are 200 pupils in the church school. And actually, the St. Phillips Church School continued until about 1900 and taught the good old reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also taught useful skills like woodworking, sewing, and music. And again, throughout the 1860s, more St. James ministers, George Dame, Joshua Peterkin, and J.B. Winchester served at St. Phillips for sporadic periods, often handling afternoon services. So I did actually pull part of the article from Harper's Weekly. I mentioned that woodcut earlier. I want to read this, and this is something interesting that we've never written about before, but I found in my research that I was thrilled to find. St. Phillips was referred to as the African Church up until about 1870. Now, we all know that there is another church in Richmond, First African Baptist Church, which also would have been referred to as the African Church and predates St. Phillips' founding. However, this Harper's Weekly article actually mentioned that St. Phillips was the home of a meeting held by Jefferson Davis and other, and I'll quote the article, fire eaters, about the Confederate intentions to arm Black soldiers at the very end of the Civil War in their fit of desperation. So I found that very interesting. I did try to confirm that with other historians. Most think that the meeting did occur at First African and not at St. Phillips, but the primary source is still interesting nonetheless. So in 1869, I remember last week somebody was saying that so many of the early St. James vestry minutes have actually disappeared, and St. Phillips has the exact same problem, where gratefully the Library of Virginia has some of our earliest vestry minutes beginning in 1869. And I had to do a little research and digging about who was behind the names, because at times I could not tell who was Black and who was white. So I had to figure out, okay, who is leading this meeting? How is the church being led? So the first vestry meeting was actually overseen by Dr. Peterkin of St. James and also the Reverend J.S. Atwell. And J.S. Atwell is a very important figure in the Diocese of Virginia. He's actually the first Black man who was ordained as a priest in the Diocese of Virginia. So he served in a missionary capacity throughout the diocese and did some work in the western part of the state and in West Virginia, but spent about 3 or 4 months at St. Phillips trying to organize the congregation. So by looking at the minutes, it's clear that there was somewhat of an equal status between Reverend Atwell and Dr. Peterkin, and there's a great deal of respect between both, which was nice to see. In 1869, the church moved to St. Mark's Chapel, which was at Fouchy and Lee Streets, and now Fouchy Street is now called St. James Street. And the church actually moved into St. Mark's Chapel, which then St. Mark's moved, I believe, to Fifth Street and now is on Boulevard. So actually multiple churches were really helping St. Phillips in its early days, and unfortunately still as somewhat of a charity project rather than as an equal congregation in Christ. A very important year in the history of St. Phillips is 1879. And 1879 was referred to by older members of St. Phillips as, and I'll quote, the Black Secession. And what does that mean? That just means that St. Phillips finally received its first permanent Black rector. And that man was the Reverend Thomas White Kane, who is pictured right here. Reverend Kane actually is the cousin of, he was born in Petersburg, and is the cousin of George Bragg, who was one of the early chroniclers of Black history in the Episcopal Church. So they're actually first cousins, and both were associated with St. Stephen's Church in Petersburg. So following Reverend Atwell's departure, St. Phillips was served again by St. James's priests until the arrival of Reverend Kane. By the end of the 1870s, the congregation had established a school. Many of Richmond's prominent African Americans who had benefited from Reconstruction were now joining and attending regularly, and the church finally had some dollars in its coffers as well, so it was able to do both mission work within the city and pay its bills. The school, again, at this point is actually always going to be thriving more than the church itself. Under Reverend Kane, the membership increases to the 50 to 100 person range, and it just continues to grow after that. And Reverend Kane has a really interesting story once he leaves Richmond. In 1889, he left for Galveston, Texas, and founded one of the first Black Episcopal churches in Texas. Unfortunately, it was a casualty of the Great Galveston Flood of 1900, and died, and his death was actually reported in Richmond. But the most interesting thing about him has nothing to do with St. Phillips. I'm a lawyer, and I know that there's some other lawyers on the call. This was fascinating to me, that actually Reverend Kane was Homer Plessy before Plessy v. Ferguson. So he actually got on a segregated railroad car and challenged his status, his second-class status on the train, and actually won in court. So his case was likely cited in Plessy versus Ferguson, which, if you don't know, is the case that legally implemented segregation in the United States. But I was glad to see that he won his case and won. I think he sued for damages of something like $100, but did end up winning his case. There's some other very notable St. Phillips members of the time. And again, the goal in telling the story of the parish is not just to explain the church's history, but to also share the stories of some of its members who should have books written about them, but just don't. So I'll just name a few. I tried to give as much diversity as possible within the congregation. I'll first talk about somebody who's not pictured. I've yet to find a picture of Addie Johnson, who was our organist for many years in the 1870s and 1880s. And in fact, she is one of the original Fisk Jubilee singers. So a world-renowned gospel group that would go from city to city and actually traveled to Europe and to the Middle East back in the late 19th century. So she was a member of St. Phillips. The man on the far left is W.M.T. Forrester, who founded the Order of St. Luke. And if that name rings a bell to you, that is the organization that Maggie Walker ran after he passed away. So the Forrester family was very prominent in Richmond. The woman next to him is Elizabeth Fentress Stannard, who actually took over for Miss Johnson and played the organ at St. Phillips well into the 20th century. I believe that my family actually knew Mrs. Stannard. And she was the president of the Richmond branch of the NAACP. She was she worked with the League of Negro Women Voters, just an incredibly civic woman throughout Richmond, and her family continued at St. Phillips for many years after her death. The man to the right of her is George St. Julian Stevens, quite a name. Mr. Stevens was the secretary of the Republican Committee for the city of Richmond, actually in the late 19th century. So the thought that a Black man is helping and voting and staying involved with politics is a real testament to the interesting role that Richmond played as a southern city. And actually, the picture that I cropped him from was actually a Black delegation that met with President Taft in 1908. And quite a few St. Phillips members were actually in the delegation. So by the 1870s and 1880s, St. Phillips is attracting the Black doctors, the Black dentists, the Black pharmacists, and some of the Black lawyers of the city of Richmond and the surrounding area. It's great to see that we can quote, the first licensed Black pharmacist in Richmond, both man and woman, were members of our church and actually married to each other. One of the first Black doctors, he's not pictured here, but Dr. J.C. Ferguson. He was the surgeon at the Central Lunatic Asylum, which is now out in Churchill, or the old building was in Churchill. Some of the other figures that I put on this page, Josiah Crump, who served as one of the city of Richmond's first Black city councilmen. So he served on the Common Council. And then Dr. John Merriweather, who was a prominent pharmacist as well. So and Alice and I talked about this before. I know that I was only supposed to go to 1865, but figured I would just share just the rest of our history together. And hopefully we can continue to build on this through this conversation and in future. But after 1879, St. Phillips and St. James did continue to work together somewhat, less than in its early years, given the segregated nature of Richmond and Virginia and the diocese itself. So following Reverend Kane's rectorate, which ended in 1887, St. James's membership and leadership took less of an active role in the church, in at least St. Phillips. And St. Phillips developed a vestry and Black priests and a leadership of its own where they were able to sustain themselves the best that they could. There were, however, intermittent moments where St. James folks showed up and helped our congregation. In 1889, right following Reverend Kane's rectorate, the Diocesan Council of Virginia actually voted to canonize segregation within the diocese. And that is documented in the 1888 and 1889 Diocesan Council journals. And there's actually a very, very fierce dissent signed by George Bragg, who I mentioned earlier, and some of the other Black priests of the diocese protesting the unchristian nature of segregation within the diocese. So our problems are systemic, and hopefully they are fixable. And things like this are definitely helping in bridging the divides. As part of the segregation that was within the diocese, St. Phillips actually did not receive full membership to the diocesan council, and we were the first Black church to do this until 1937. So just think about how recent that is given the scheme of the history of our churches. In 1896, St. Phillips at that point had begun to grow financially as well. Again, it had attracted some of the wealthier Black people of Richmond. And a new brick church was constructed at St. James and Lee Streets. And that church was where my grandmother was christened, where my great-grandfather was christened, and a lot of family memories there. And some of the St. Phillips members on the call, some of their family members also remember being in that church. And that church still stands today at the corner of St. James and Lee. And I believe that it is a Pentecostal church now. But St. James's members, as a gift to St. Philip's congregation, donated new light fixtures and benches for the sanctuary. That church was slightly more ornate than the first, and also a really interesting moment between St. James and St. Philip's throughout the early 20th century. St. James was actually the site of a few different funerals for prominent African Americans in Richmond, and some of them being St. Philip's members. So in 1937 as well, our rector, the Reverend Dr. Junius Taylor, passed away, and his funeral was actually held at St. James and done by Dr. Gibson. the funeral actually made the Richmond Times-Dispatch and all the other newspapers, and noted the integrated nature of the service. So I believe that Dr. Taylor actually was one of the first Black men at St. James Church to actually celebrate the Eucharist with white priests. So that's quite a moment for both the congregations. Also, just an interesting detail that I could not find a picture of this man, but Silas Shackelford, who served as a vestryman and a senior warden at St. Phillips, served as the sexton at St. James until his death in 1915. And I believe he was another person who was actually funeralized at St. James rather than St. Phillips, but officiated over by our priest at the time. So that I just gave you a snapshot of what I've been working on. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now, or I answer my email pretty regularly as well. It's kenneth.anderson@richmond.edu. I kept my school email. And if you're interested in the complete history of St. Phillips, please look out for our upcoming church history this fall, and I will make sure to keep everyone posted on the committee just to see where this project goes. But I do appreciate you listening to me this evening and happy to answer any questions.
Hey, Ken, I just wanted to also reiterate what you were saying about our history. So we will include the information that Ken told you about St. Phillips and St. James in the next section, which is 1865 to 1900, and then the section after that. So, you know, what we've got now, which Hillary will send out, part 1, it only goes pretty much, we might have a little stuff about St. Phillips after that, but it's mostly during that time period. So I'm sure Ken will let me use everything that he already has.
Absolutely.
For the next section that we do. And so one thing I wanted to, the story that I wanted you to tell, Ken, was, and it's in the report as well, the story about the St. Mark's windows.
Sure.
Why don't you just tell a story about that?
Sure thing. So for many years, St. Phillips actually broadcast the fact that Mrs. Jeb Stewart, who was a very, very devoted Episcopalian, donated the windows at not the church that is on the screen right now, but at the former St. Mark's Chapel building, and actually donated windows to St. Philip's Church. Unfortunately, that is not true. So after reading the vestry minutes a little closer, learned that she actually donated the windows to St. Mark's Church, and then we bought their building. So for many years, it was just told that Mrs. Stewart donated our windows, and sort of a connection to Jeb Stewart that a lot of our members honestly probably wouldn't have asked for, but it turns out that she actually donated to St. Mark's and not to St. Philip's. Right.
And one other thing I wanted to add relating to what the diocese did in terms of getting it started was in Blind Spots. You know, that's the book that Chris Graham wrote on St. Paul's. He told a story about what happened with the diocese relating to starting Black Church. And basically what he said, and Ken said this, that Blacks were going to the the Baptist Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church and leaving the Episcopal Church. And the diocese was, you know, kind of going crazy about it. Like, why is this happening? What we need to do something about it. And so they did a survey of all the Episcopal churches in the state. And while they didn't get a huge response, when they looked at it, they decided, regardless of what the survey said, was that the reason that African Americans were leaving in droves was because they were looking for fellowship from the Episcopal Church, and because of the way things were in the church, separate, segregation, they couldn't get that fellowship. They had to be up in the gallery and that sort of thing. And so they concluded, well, we can't give them what they want, so we'll just, you know, help them start a church. So it kind of corroborates what Ken said.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken, so much. I want to echo all of the praise that has been coming up in the chat box. I'll just read it out loud in case for posterity purposes, in case the chat box doesn't save. Fantastic presentation, Ken, says Dr. Crutcher. Dr. McCard says, thank you, Kenneth. Rixie Booth says, fantastic presentation. Becky DeCamps, excellent presentation, Ken, thank you. Jane Dowrick writes, Ken, thank you for your research and this great presentation. Andy Bennett also says, such a great presentation. And Antonia Vassar says, thank you so much for this. So I want to echo all of that as well.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Marlene writes, St. Phillips is blessed to have you. Thank you for your dedication.
Thanks.
Judy Philpott wrote in the chat box a little earlier, canonized segregation. This is really difficult.
It is something that I think we're still grappling with today, just to think about the fact that, when we see 18 or 19 in a date, it feels like a long time ago. But then when you start to do the math of how long, people are living, and the fact that my, great-grandfather and great-great-grandparents experienced, or were alive actually, in 1889, and members of the church at that time, we're not that far removed, and we still have so much work to do. So it's a good reminder, definitely not to live in the past, but to know it so that we can make the future that much better.
Absolutely.
And more Christ-like, honestly. So from a Christian perspective. But.
Amen. Are there any other questions? I'm afraid I can't see everybody at the same time. So if you have a question and no one else is already speaking, go ahead and just pipe up, or you can try raising your hand.
And you probably don't need to screen share so that maybe you can see everybody.
That's right. Good idea. There we go.
Ken, this is Harry Warner. Thank you for such a great presentation. I know this is the end of, at least for us at this moment, about our history, but can you tell us how St. Phillips is doing now?
Sure. So I would say that we're a vibrant church that has adapted to the pandemic, much like everyone else, and figuring out how things are going. We actually just brought in our new priest in charge, Reverend Marlene, and I guess it's almost been 2 years at this point, which it feels like yesterday, but I guess we're navigating the pandemic together, and working through that. Let's see, the parish itself, I believe that we have between 300 and 600 members, somewhere in that range, located on the north side, and do a good deal of mission work, both within the city and throughout the diocese. And we have some representation from our parish on diocesan committees as well. So trying to stay as involved as possible with the diocese, and making sure that the Black voice of the church is heard as well.
A few more questions have popped up in the box. Judy Philpott writes, thank you so much, Ken Anderson. John Reynolds asks, would Ken mind repeating his email address?
Yes, we'll do. I'll actually put it in the chat right now, and happy to answer any questions that anybody has. Our 20th century history is also relatively interesting, just because so many civil rights leaders also attended St. Phillips. So I mentioned Plessy v. Ferguson earlier, but one of the co-counsel of Brown versus Board, Spotswood Robinson, was a vestryman at St. Phillips, a very prominent lawyer and later judge, and just a few other people who, again, broke down barriers. Some of the Richmond 34 who sat in at Tallheimer's many years ago, also St. Phillips members. So, and then I see in the chat, it says, remind me what year St. Phillips moved to its current location. We left the old church at St. James and Lee in 1959 and have been on the north side ever since. And then I see here as well that Congressman McEachin was mentioned. Yes, he is the congressman for the district that surrounds Richmond, and Donald McEachin's grandfather, in fact, Donald McEachin's first name is Aston Donald McEachin, and he's named for his grandfather, the Reverend Aston Hamilton, who was actually the principal of the John Moncure School, which was an Episcopal boarding school for Black boys out in Miller's Tavern in Essex County. I think that's Middle Peninsula. And then he came to St. Phillips during World War II, and he actually baptized my grandmother. So I got to interview the congressman for the project and enjoyed sharing that fact with him. And I see Dr. Crutcher, your hand is up. Good to see you.
I just want to say just how proud I am of you, Ken.
Oh, thanks.
I've known Ken since my first year at the University of Richmond. He was in my mentoring group, and thank you just so much for your passion for doing this history. It's critically important. And so, but my question is, I do have a question. Tell us a little bit about your new, or your relatively new rector.
Yes. So first off, thank you so much. I could not have a better mentor, everyone. Dr. Crutcher is just great. And Reverend Marlene is wonderful. It has been great to get to know her over the last 2 years. She hails from Northern Virginia and has just adapted to Richmond greatly and is well liked within our congregation. She just wrote actually an essay in a book called Preaching Black Lives Matter, and has just written some really interesting things on the role of race and gender in the church, and also is just a phenomenal preacher as well. We're grateful to have her.
Thank you.
And you're so nice.
Thanks.
I appreciate that.
And I see here in the chat, let's see, it may be very clear to others, but want to ask anyway. I've always heard that St. James became uneasy at the number of Blacks who were worshiping at St. James's, so they helped found St. Phillips less out of altruism than out of racism. Is this true? So I would argue that, and this is definitely opinion, but because our early vestry minutes do not exist from 1861, so I don't have the direct quote. But just given the context of the time and understanding that society was so incredibly segregated in 1861, that likely segregation did spur the, indirectly spur the creation of St. Phillips. Now, granted, the fact that, again, it's a complicated relationship that the diocese and St. James's members had with the original members of St. Phillips, given that they wanted to make sure that, again, Black folks were saved and sitting in an Episcopal church rather than a Baptist church. But at the same time, there were questions of whether or not Black folks were actually equal from a human perspective with white folks. So I think that it's probably a little bit of both, but I lean toward the side, unfortunately, of it's a positive byproduct of the segregation and racism that founded the parish. And then I see, is the building at St. James and Lee still there? Yes, still exists, and it is, I think, a Pentecostal church. It's right at St. James and Lee on that corner, and still exists. And glad to see that, Ms. Philpott, you'll be visiting us. We look forward to seeing you. And hopefully we'll all be in person soon where we can all get together without masks and worship together.
Ken, this is Ed Jewett. I'm clerk of the court here in Richmond. We have the records of the Richmond 34. I don't know if everyone in the listening tonight is familiar with that, but they were a group of Virginia Union students who were arrested at a sit-in at Tallheimer's. And a few years ago, we had a ceremony where we expunged the records of some of them. But we still have records for many of them. So I invite you to come down sometime to the courthouse. I'll be glad to show you that very interesting historical case, which went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, where they
will be giving you a call.
Right. So just call me at the court anytime and I'll be glad to show it to you, or anyone else would like.
Thanks so much. And I see there's another question. Was St. James Street named for St. James? So that part of the city, and much of it has changed given the fact that the northern part of the neighborhood is now parts of Gilpin Court and the highway. But that actual section of Richmond was called Apostletown. And so there's St. John, St. Paul, St. Peter, and St. James streets. So I don't think it was named for St. James Church, but that, so. And then I see, did not elaborate on the statement that funerals for prominent members of St. Phillips often were held at St. James. Sounds rather patronizing to me that the sort of idea prominent Black people could partake of whatever benefits St. James offered, but not everyone. So I guess the word prominent there, I mean more either folks that had a connection to St. James or people who had enough people come to their funeral where they actually did not fit at St. Phillips. So Dr. Taylor was well known throughout the city in both Black and white circles. So the church was almost too small at St. Phillips to host him. And then for Mr. Shackelford, because he had the relationship with St. James, he was able to have his funeral there.
And Ken, a question, was Dr. Taylor related to Professor Porter Taylor?
I'm not sure about that, but I can do some research. I do know that his one son was a doctor, and he lived in the Midwest and actually donated our Christus Rex at the current church back in the 60s. But I know he was a medical doctor, but I will find out.
But I had another question for you. You told me, you said, did I hear you say you grew up in the Baptist church?
I did. So my grandmother, who was christened at St. Phillips, met my grandfather, and they made a deal, and I was immersed and not sprinkled as a result 2 generations later. But then I came back. I could feel it in my heart and came right back to the Episcopal Church. So my grandmother was thrilled. So
You're in good company, Ken.
thanks.
That's fascinating, because I grew up in the Baptist church.
Oh, okay.
And it was not until we moved to Austin, Texas in 1994 that my wife and I converted to the Episcopal Church. We joined St. James Episcopal in Austin, Texas, which at that time was a mission church.
Oh, okay.
And ironically, I reluctantly went to the church to visit the church because we had been Congregationalists before that. And when we lived in Cleveland, I reluctantly went and fell in love with, the rector at the time was Bill Miller. Some of you may know Bill Miller. He's out in Hawaii now. He does music and stuff in the church, but he was the rector there. It was magnificent. And the church at the time in Austin was a mission. And we were there when it became a full church, if you will.
Nice. It is interesting how so many people make the journey from different denominations, but there's something just about Episcopal liturgy that's always been powerful for me. So
I agree with you.
Ken, I have a couple of questions. One of the women on your slides that you showed a photo of, her middle name was Fentress, and as you were talking, I was like, Fentress, I know that name. There's Reverend Dr. Judy Fentress Williams is a professor at Virginia Theological Seminary. Do you think that they might be related?
I have to wonder. So that was her maiden name, so they very well could be. But I'm not sure, but I should do some research.
That'd be interesting. All these little.
It is funny how the names all seem to connect. So my mother's family, they're Scots, and I know that there are Scots all over, the city of Richmond. So, and I know that we have, the lines mix. I'll say that as the farther back that you go. So it's very interesting to know who you're related to.
That is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also curious that you talked about the Dr. Gibson celebrating Eucharist. Was it with Reverend Taylor? Was that?
I believe so. Yes. Mm-hmm.
You said that year was it 1937? You said that was.
So his Dr. Taylor died in 1937. So his funeral was celebrated at St. James then, but the Eucharist I think was celebrated in the mid-20s. So I can get that date for you. And I believe it was not a regular church service. It was a special occasion, so.
That'll be important for us to keep our eyes open for when we get to that chunk of the history, when we research it. We did a course not too long ago on civil discourse here at St. James's on Wednesday night. And one of the things that we talked about was how the liturgy really can bring together so many, that just has such a power to bring people up from a variety of backgrounds and experiences together who otherwise might not join together.
Absolutely.
And the power of Jesus and in the sacrament.
And then I see here, would members of St. Phillips be comfortable visiting us at St. James? Wondering if an exchange program might be good for us to become closer. I know that I'm interested in visiting St. Phillips. I think it would be great if our two churches continue to worship with each other. Coming over to Haynes Avenue, we'll come over to, I guess, Franklin Street, and definitely make that more of a regular exchange. I unfortunately have never I live in the neighborhood and have never visited St. James, but walked by and admired the building many times. So I will stop in one Sunday when things are safer.
And so you're related to the Scotts of Scott Funeral Home?
So distant cousins, apparently.
Okay.
I've yet to find the direct relation, but
you know that they are some of their descendants are buried in the slave burying ground on the campus of the University of Richmond.
oh, I did not know that.
Yes,
Oh,
yeah. I
good to know.
met a couple of months ago. Betty and I met with about 25 of the descendants, and the two of the brother Scotts who run the funeral home were there.
Oh wow, okay, very nice.
And you know, Rhonda is related
Oh, okay.
to them at the development office in Richmond. You know Rhonda.
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a small world.
Yeah.
It really is.
And I have a question.
Yes.
You talked about Bishop John Johns, and I know that he was one that wanted Black churches, and I know that Bishop Meade, who my home church, Meade Memorial in Alexandria, is named for, was a flip-flopper. He was a slave owner, and he went back and forth in how he viewed the slavery and how he viewed the Black church. Did you come across anything about possibly Bishop Johns and Bishop Meade going head-to-head on that issue?
So have not found any conflict, but I think that actually Reverend John or Bishop Johns is actually in somewhat of the same category with Bishop Meade in that he was a secessionist. I'm not sure if he owned slaves, but I do know that he was very much not an abolitionist, I can tell you that. So the fact that he was, again, it's just so much irony with these earlier churchmen in that, you know, they're trying to save Black souls, and yet at the same time they're perfectly comfortable owning people. So it is just a crazy paradox. But so, and I will say both of them were united actually not in race relations, but in a hatred of high churchmanship. So one of the big, and I forgot to mention earlier that, and this was mentioned last week, that St. Phillips for most of its history has worshipped in sort of a higher tradition until relatively recently. And that is sort of among so many Black Episcopal churches throughout the country, you'll find that those churches are often on the higher side when it comes to liturgy and smells and bells. And that very well could be, you know, the result of maybe trying to do it better than, sort of one up the rest of the church in their worship. So,
and Ken, St. James's tries to be low church, so you know we got to find the middle there.
Exactly. I actually watched your anniversary video and really enjoyed that. And I don't even know, some of you might have been on that video, but I remember somebody telling a story about Dr. Gibson, I guess it was, saying, well, I'll put candles on the altar because the next guy's going to have a problem with, you know, getting the candles on. So it's so interesting how change affects different congregations. It really is.
What's funny is St. James's first rector was high church. Was it Reverend MP, Dr. MP? Came from upstate New York, and apparently stuck around in the diocese in order to annoy Bishop Meade.
Oh, wow. Huh.
Isn't that right, Alice? Didn't we find that somewhere? Yeah.
Yeah, listening to their comments on Catholicism and high churchmanship are, wow, I'll just say that. Not politically correct for today or probably back then. So.
Well, are there any more questions? I see we're coming up on our time here. Well, I want to invite folks to wave their hands or applaud. Thank you so much, Ken. This was just so wonderful. Thank you for all your work and for sharing it with us tonight. And we look forward to following you. And yes, if when you present again, or when you all have another history lesson at St. Phillips, we would love to hear about it and promote it here at St. James's. So be sure to pass that word along.
Will do. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for engaging in the conversation. It's great that we're able to talk about this, especially in the era that we're in, where folks are not talking to each other. So it is good to, discuss some of these somewhat uncomfortable issues so that we can move forward.
Yep.
And make sure
Thanks,
that we're not
Ken.
repeating the past. So thanks again.
Yeah,
Thanks for
I'll
having
be
me.
talking to you.
I want to remind everybody that we continue next week with a discussion of part 1 of The Black Church, the Henry Louis Gates Jr. Recent PBS special. So watch it between now and then, and then join us. We did get a heads up that it might no longer be available for free. So I'm going to look into that, and I will be sure to email everybody who is registered information about how to access the film if it is no longer still available for free. So thank you all very much again for joining us. God bless you, and keep you well this night.